Sarah felt her phone vibrate against the white linen tablecloth just as Mark reached across the candlelit table to refill her wine glass, his eyes warm with the same affection she'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. But when she glanced down at the screen, her heart stopped. The message from an unknown number read, "Stand up and leave right now. Don't say a word to him. If you stay, you'll regret it forever." And suddenly the romantic Italian restaurant, with its soft violin music and the scent of garlic and rosemary, felt like it was closing in around her. The walls pressing closer as Mark smiled at her, completely unaware, asking if she'd decided on the seafood pasta or the risotto, and she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't understand who would send such a message or why. Her mind racing through possibilities, like flipping through a book too fast to read the words. Sarah's hand trembled as she set down her menu, studying Mark's face for any sign of deception, any crack in the foundation of their marriage. But all she saw was the man who'd held her hand through 2 miscarriages, who'd learned to braid their daughter Emma's hair when Sarah was too exhausted from chemotherapy 3 years ago, who'd built a treehouse in their backyard with his own hands, even though he was terrified of heights. And yet this message, these words, glowing on her screen, suggested there was something dark lurking beneath the surface of their life together. "Sarah, honey, you look paler. You feeling all right?" Mark asked, genuine concern crossing his features as he reached for her hand. But she pulled away instinctively, watching hurt flash in his eyes. And another text arrived. "He's been lying to you. I have proof. Leave now, and I'll explain everything. You deserve the truth." And Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her, the restaurant spinning as she tried to reconcile the man sitting across from her with the implications of these messages, her chest tightening with a pain that had nothing to do with her old illness and everything to do with the possibility that her entire life might be built on deception. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that made nearby diners turn to look, and Mark's face transformed from concern to confusion to something that looked like fear. And he stood too, asking what was wrong. Was it her health? Should he call Dr. Morrison? But Sarah couldn't speak, the words caught in her throat like shards of glass. And she grabbed her purse and walked toward the exit, each step feeling like a betrayal of everything they'd built together, yet also feeling like self-preservation, like survival, like the only choice she had. Mark followed her into the parking lot, the cool evening air hitting her face like a wake-up call, and he caught her arm gently, not restraining but pleading. "Sarah, please, talk to me. What's happening? Did I do something wrong?" And she finally found her voice, shaking and raw. "Who is she, Mark? Just tell me who she is." And the confusion on his face looked so genuine that for a moment she doubted the messages, doubted the unknown sender, doubted everything except the fact that her heart was breaking in real time. "Who is who? Sarah, I don't understand. There's no one. There's never been anyone but you. Please, you're scaring me," Mark said, his voice cracking with emotion. And Sarah pulled out her phone to show him the messages. But when she opened the thread, there was a new text. "Meet me at Cedar Park, the bench near the fountain. Come alone. I'll show you what kind of man you married." And she looked up at Mark, searching his eyes for truth, for lies, for anything that would help her know which way to turn. "I need to go somewhere," she said quietly, and Mark's face crumpled. "You're leaving me. Just like that. After 15 years, after everything we've been through." And Sarah felt tears burning down her cheeks as she shook her head. "I don't know what I'm doing. I just need to understand what's happening." And she got in her car and drove to Cedar Park, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white, her mind flooded with memories of their wedding day, of bringing Emma home from the hospital, of Mark sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed during her treatment, of every beautiful moment now tainted by doubt and fear. Cedar Park was nearly empty at this hour, just a few streetlights casting long shadows across the walking paths, and Sarah found the bench near the fountain. its water trickling softly in the darkness, and she sat down and waited, her phone clutched in her hand, jumping at every sound, every movement in the shadows, until she heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see a woman in her 60s with silver hair and familiar blue eyes, eyes that Sarah had seen somewhere before, but couldn't quite place. "Sarah," the woman said softly, sitting down beside her, "I'm so sorry to frighten you like this, but I had to make sure you'd come, had to make sure you'd listen." And Sarah's voice came out sharp with pain and anger. "Who are you? What do you want? What lies have you been spreading about my husband?" But the woman's eyes filled with tears, and she reached into her purse, pulling out a photograph, old and worn at the edges, showing a young couple holding a newborn baby. "My name is Catherine Wheeler," the woman said, her voice trembling, "and 37 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I gave up my son for adoption because I was 17 and terrified, and my parents said I had no choice, and I've spent every day since then wondering about him, searching for him. And 6 months ago I finally found him." And she pointed to the baby in the photograph, then pulled out another picture. This one, a photocopy of adoption records with Mark's birth name, his birth date. Details that Sarah had never known, because Mark had always said his childhood was too painful to discuss. That his adoptive parents had passed away before they'd met, that he had no other family. Sarah's anger shifted to confusion as she looked at the photographs, at the dates, at Catherine's face, and she whispered, "You're Mark's birth mother." And Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I hired a private investigator. I found him. I learned everything about him, about you, about Emma, about the beautiful life he's built, and I've been watching from a distance, too afraid to approach, too ashamed of what I did. But tonight, when I saw you both at the restaurant, I couldn't stay away anymore. I had to meet you. Had to know if there was any chance he might want to know me too." And Sarah felt the weight of understanding crash over her. The realization that this wasn't about betrayal or lies, but about a desperate mother's longing, about secrets Mark himself might not even know, about a past that had been buried but never truly gone. "Why did you tell me to leave?" Sarah asked, her voice softer now, and Catherine looked ashamed. "I panicked. I thought, if I could get you alone, I could explain, could ask you to help me reach out to him. But I realize now how cruel that was, how those messages must have sounded. I wasn't thinking clearly. I've waited so long, and when I saw him tonight, saw how happy he looked with you, I broke." And Sarah saw in this woman's face a mother's love, desperate and profound, the same love she felt for Emma, and she understood that Catherine's methods were wrong, but her heart was right, and she made a decision that would change all their lives. "Mark doesn't know he's adopted," Sarah said quietly, and Catherine's face went pale. "His adoptive parents never told him." And Sarah shook her head. "He knows. But he's never wanted to search for his birth parents. He told me once that he felt abandoned, that whoever gave him up didn't want him, and it was easier to not know than to confirm that feeling." And Catherine's sob was so raw, so full of regret that Sarah found herself reaching out to hold this stranger's hand, this woman whose pain was written in every line of her face. "I wanted him," Catherine whispered. "I wanted him so much, but I was a child myself, and my parents said I'd ruin his life, ruin my life, that the kindest thing I could do was give him to a family who could provide for him, and I believed them, and I've regretted it every single day for 37 years. And Sarah felt her own tears falling as she thought about Emma, about how she would move mountains, tear down the sky itself before giving her daughter up. But she also thought about Catherine's situation, about being 17 and scared and pressured, about how different the world was back then, about how easy it was to judge a decision you'd never had to make. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Mark, who answered on the first ring, his voice frantic. "Sarah, where are you? Are you okay? Please come back. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it." And Sarah took a deep breath. "Mark, I'm at Cedar Park, and I need you to come here. There's someone you need to meet." And she could hear the hesitation in his voice, the confusion, but also the trust. The fundamental trust they'd built over 15 years. And he said, "I'm on my way." And Sarah sat with Catherine in the soft darkness. Two women bound by their love for the same person, waiting for the moment that would either heal old wounds or open new ones. When Mark's car pulled into the parking lot, Sarah stood, and Catherine stood beside her, trembling like a leaf in a storm, and Mark walked toward them, his eyes moving from Sarah to Catherine and back again, questions written all over his face. And Sarah took his hand, felt the familiar warmth of his skin, the strength of his fingers, and she said, "Mark, this is Catherine Wheeler, and she has something to tell you that's going to be difficult to hear. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. And whatever you feel, whatever you need, we'll handle it together." And she guided him to the bench, sat beside him, and nodded to Catherine to begin. Catherine's voice shook as she told her story, showed him the photographs, the documents, explained the circumstances of his birth and her impossible choice. And Sarah watched Mark's face transform through a dozen emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, pain, and something else. Something that looked like the filling of an empty space he'd never acknowledged was there. And when Catherine finished, Mark sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, his hand gripping Sarah's like a lifeline, his breathing uneven and rough. "You gave me up," he finally said, his voice flat and hollow, and Catherine nodded. "I did, and I've regretted it every moment since." And Mark's anger broke through. "You don't get to regret it now. You don't get to show up 37 years later and expect forgiveness. A relationship. You made your choice." And his words were sharp enough to cut. But Sarah heard the pain underneath, the voice of every child who'd ever felt unwanted, and she squeezed his hand, let him know she was there. "You're right," Catherine said, her voice steady despite her tears. "I don't get to expect anything. I have no right to your forgiveness or your time. But I needed you to know that giving you up wasn't because I didn't want you. It was because I was a scared child who made a decision I've paid for every day of my life. And you deserved to know that you were wanted. You were loved, even as I signed those papers. Even as I held you for the last time, you were loved." And something in Mark's expression cracked, the armor he'd built around his abandoned heart showing its first fissure. They sat there in the park for over 2 hours, Catherine answering Mark's questions about his biological father, a high school boyfriend who'd left town and never knew about the pregnancy. His medical history, her side of the family, was healthy. No genetic concerns. Why she'd waited so long to search for him: fear, shame, believing he was better off without her. And slowly, incrementally, Sarah watched her husband's defenses lower, watched him begin to see Catherine, not as the woman who'd abandoned him, but as a person who'd made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances. And she saw him beginning to understand that his worth wasn't determined by her decision, that being given up for adoption didn't mean he was unlovable. It meant a teenager had been forced into an unbearable situation. "I have a daughter," Mark said suddenly, pulling out his phone and showing Catherine a picture of Emma, 10 years old, with Mark's dark hair and Sarah's smile. "Her name is Emma, and she's the best thing I've ever done. And I can't imagine, I literally cannot imagine any circumstance where I would give her up." And Catherine looked at the photo with such longing, such grandmotherly love that Sarah's heart ached. And Catherine said, "That's because you're a wonderful father, because you have resources and support, and you live in a different world than I did. But I understand I would look at my friends' children and think the same thing. How did I do it? How did I survive it? And the truth is, I didn't. Not really. Some part of me has been frozen at 17, holding a baby I'll never hold again, until now, until tonight, until you gave me the chance to explain." Mark looked at Sarah then, really looked at her, and said, "You knew when you left the restaurant. You found this out, and you called me. You brought me here. You could have sent her away, and Sarah touched his face gently. She's your mother, Mark. She made a mistake in how she approached us. But her love is real. I can see it. And I thought about what I would want if I were you, and I knew you'd want the choice. The chance to decide for yourself. And Mark's eyes filled with tears. I thought you were leaving me. I thought I'd lost you. And Sarah shook her head. You're not getting rid of me that easily. We've been through too much. We're forever. And they held each other while Catherine watched, giving them space, understanding that her presence had already disrupted enough. Before they left the park that night, Mark did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked Catherine if she wanted to get coffee sometime, maybe talk more, maybe get to know each other slowly, with no expectations and no promises, just two people trying to build something from the rubble of the past. And Catherine's face lit up with such hope, such careful, fragile joy that Sarah knew they were doing the right thing, knew that this unexpected, frightening evening had opened a door that needed to be opened, even if no one had known it was there. Over the following months, Mark and Catherine met regularly, sometimes with Sarah present, sometimes alone, building a relationship that wasn't quite mother and son, but wasn't strangers either. Something uniquely their own. And Catherine met Emma, became a grandmother figure who brought gifts and told stories about Mark's biological grandparents, filling in pieces of his history he'd never known. And Sarah watched her husband heal from wounds he'd spent his whole life pretending didn't exist, watched him become lighter, more complete, more at peace with his own story. 1 year after that frightening night at the restaurant, they all gathered at Mark and Sarah's home for Emma's 11th birthday. And as Sarah watched Mark laughing with Catherine while they decorated the cake, watched Emma showing her grandmother a school project, she thought about that message on her phone. Those words that had made her heart stop, stand up and leave, don't say a word to him. And she realized that sometimes the things that terrify us, that shake the foundations of our lives, are exactly what we need to build something stronger, something more honest, something more whole. That evening, after the guests had left and Emma was in bed, Mark found Sarah on the back porch, looking at the stars. And he wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, and he said quietly, "Thank you for trusting me that night, for not actually leaving, for bringing me to meet her, for seeing what I needed before I knew I needed it." And Sarah turned in his embrace, looking into the eyes of the man she'd chosen to love every day for 15 years. And she said, "That's what love is, not just staying for the easy parts, but staying for the hard parts, the confusing parts, the parts where you don't have all the answers but you have each other. And that's enough." And they stood there in the darkness, two people who'd been tested and had chosen each other again, who'd learned that sometimes the messages that frighten us most are the ones that lead us exactly where we need to go. And that family isn't just about biology or law, it's about the people who show up, who do the work, who love even when it's hard, who build bridges instead of walls, and who understand that the human heart has an infinite capacity for healing when we're brave enough to let it.